thank you. I just wanted to say to Simon Taylor just how moved I was by that. And after the Euro Cup final, I'm not a great football fan, I'm afraid to say, but I found myself driving to Manchester late at night because I felt I had to pay tribute on behalf of my community to the poster of Marcus Rashford, which had been defaced the day before. And I kind of left at 8:30 p.m. in an electric car, which means stopping 2 or 3 times on the way, hoping you can refuel. And thinking, why am I doing this? And the reason I was doing it was connected with my grandfather having been in Dachau, and I thought, I cannot be the descendant of a victim of racism and then do nothing about seeing it in my own society. I got there at 2:30 in the morning. There was almost nobody there. There was one other, it was a young student from the university who said also, I just have to be here, I have to pay tribute to this. There's things one has to do. I really, really appreciate it. I really appreciate it. Your presentation just now. Thank you. Thank you. I was really, my understanding is I was asked to talk about the different generations, the first, the second, and the third, and the role of the HAR. And I'm a great admirer of the HAR because it's supported my family in so many ways. The journal is outstanding, it's challenging, it's intellectually and artistically rich. It gives a sense of context and togetherness. My mother, my late father, they appreciated it hugely. So I don't think I've got much to add, but I do want to speak my appreciation. And I'll try and say a word about different generations. As a second generation, both my parents were refugees at the age of 16. My mother's family, the rabbinic family from Frankfurt, they fled here. They left Germany on the 9th of April 1939 through the help of the British consulate in Frankfurt. And my grandfather, Rabbi Salzberger, helped found the Belsae Square congregation. My father's family came from Breslau, and they got visas to Palestine. He was also 16 when he found himself effectively the family's breadwinner in a very impoverished Jerusalem. So just thinking back to my parents and indeed my grandparents' generation, what do I feel the AJR has offered them? A huge degree of companionship. A sense of not being alone culturally. I spend a lot of time with my mother's parents. They would talk about the art, the Jewish and wider intellectual figures of their time. Part of them was still in Frankfurt, and having an organization like the AJR meant that they did not feel alone in that context. That the memory, the literature, the language, and the experiences were contextualized within a sense of community that meant the world to them. If I think now of what so often happens to refugees to this country and how they are dispersed, I think of one young man who lived locally in a tent in Victoria Park, less than a mile from where I live, who was rehoused to the northeast of England and refused to go. And when I wrote to my local MP saying, can we not do better for him than a tent for 3 months? He said, well, he was told to go to the northeast of England. And I replied, but refugees also need community. You can't send them to somewhere where they know nobody, have no religious context, and are totally isolated. Unfortunately, my MP didn't get it. But the AJR has totally got it for that generation. I also want to recognize how the AJR has been prominent in highlighting the contribution to society of so many who came as refugees to this country. This is well known on the Kindertransport as domestics who made their way. But it's not just the contribution of Jewish refugees to society, it's actually a contribution to the understanding of what society is in a multicultural context. And that's extremely important, as we've just heard, because the debate as to what society ought to be is absolutely ongoing. And you actually, Michael, you asked me to add this. It's not just about the contributions of those who are successful in the arts, the sciences, and intellectual life, as so many Jewish refugees were. It's also about the fact that the society includes, cares for, and has a responsibility to care for those who are going to struggle as a result of their experiences. And I will not forget how I was contacted to conduct the funeral of a woman called Greta Seligman. She had dementia, so it was you couldn't ask her about her past. She had come, we didn't know exactly when, 37, 38, to this country. She had struggled with the emotional impact of being a refugee and had been in and out of Jewish and sort of national health care institutions. There were no known relatives. She was clearly a very well-mannered, polite, thoughtful person. We knew nothing. There were 4 of us at the funeral, 5 of us. There were 2 of her carers. You were there, there was myself, and there was my son. And that was it. And then we thought, who's going to put up a gravestone for her? And I talked to my community about it. There was no difficulty finding the funding for it, but it was challenging to think of the words. And I asked Dawn, I asked David Cesarani. And we agreed together on the following. Greta Seligman, who, fleeing the terrors of Nazi Europe, came alone, also in memory of her parents and all the parents who with selfless love sent their children to safety in an unknown land. And there's something about the role of the AJR, World Jewish Relief as well, in highlighting what society is and should be and could be. I'll come back to that later. I'm part of the second generation. I may not be alone in failing to realize that fact until I was probably in my 40s at least, because one takes one's upbringings kind of for granted. That's how you grow up. It was probably as I married and we had children that I realized that Nikki, my wife's background, was so radically different. Her family had come from Poland, had been in the fruit markets, had then bought an apple orchard in Kent to, as it were, supply the fruit markets at Smithfield, and had been much more English. So I thought I grew up in North London. I didn't. I grew up in an enclave of German refugees in North London. And actually, just about everything was different. First of all, language. Although I didn't speak fluent German, I was used to this conflation in the same sentence. Gib the Katze some Milch would have been a typical example. The reading matter. Where did the quotations come from? Goethe, Schiller, Heine. That's perhaps not typical because my grandparents preserved a love of German culture and distinguished it from Nazism. I have to say there was very little humor in my upbringing and a limited amount of fun. I was so ignorant of English television that I couldn't even name the Beatles when I met Nikki, something which is considered unforgivable to this day. All the guests, when I thought about it, all the guests at Friday night and Shabbat festivals were German or Austrian Jewish refugees, pretty much without an exception. And it was so pervasive that I didn't realize there was anything unusual about that. But now I see that it's a very, very specific culture which leaves a complex legacy in all kinds of ways. And I think it wasn't until my father died, now 14 years ago, that I became more curious about it and tried to preserve it. I wrote about my father's family in my book, My Dear Ones, One Family and the Final Solution. And right at the beginning I said, my father was much less voluble about it than my mother's family. And also his family, many had perished. And so I just didn't know, but I had these hints, and why didn't I explore them? Why didn't I ask questions? And I wonder how many second generation people like me grow up with thinking, the clues were there, but I left it too late to follow them. I met in my researches the German historian Götz Ali, who said there's something in common with everybody who comes to see me, whether they're trying to find out about being a survivor or being the descendant of somebody who was a persecutor. It's always after their parents have died, and always with that question, why didn't I ask earlier? And I found myself, I suppose I got to know the ghosts better, but more important, I wanted to know them. I wanted to know them better. And it's influenced small things about my behaviors, and I imagine I'm not alone. I brought one kind of show and tell item, which is a kilner jar, because in one of the letters I found, my father's aunt, Sophie, who perished in probably early 1943 in Auschwitz after going to Theresienstadt, wrote about bottling fruit in the wonderful summer of her garden in what was then Moravia in 1938. And I thought, how do I preserve this legacy? Well, food is another great indicator of this. So the impact on us of a second generation to have companions, to have understanding, to have that articulated in testimony, in art, in friendships, is a huge ongoing role for the AJR, following on from the 80th anniversary in this generation ahead. And it's made me ask the question, what about my children, our children, and third generation, and the Association of Jewish Refugees? I have no answer to that question, and that's part of my struggle. I have no idea how my children will take that legacy forward. And perhaps the following is not unusual. It pertains to my family, it may not pertain to others. That when all the Wittenberg, Salzburger clan came together when I was growing up, there were 7 of us around the table. And I would hear all kinds of accounts about the family meeting in Frankfurt or elsewhere with plays and sketches and music and cousins and everything. I heard about it, but it didn't happen in my life. Now, there are 14 of us. And in the sukkah, 12 of us were actually together. But for Nikki, my wife's family, I think Stamford Bridge would do. But we joked that we needed Wembley Stadium. We're so outnumbered that kind of part of my worry is, will this history just be lost? It'll just dissolve and be gone. And I can't perhaps justify it, but I'd be sorry. They've read my book, but I don't know where they'll want to take it, and that there should be some knowledge and understanding, and also a sense of the huge cultural and Jewish riches of continental Europe is, as a rabbi, terribly important. Now, all of this is within the generations of Jewish community, but the role of the AJR, as you said, and has already been clearly said, goes far beyond ourselves. You asked me to think of quotations, and for looking at our own history, the verse from Deuteronomy came to my mind, which my father in his old age often used to quote, Sha'al avicha v'yagedecha zekeinecha v'yomu lach. Ask your father, and he will tell you, your elders, and they will relate it to you. That's about our own history. But when we look beyond ourselves, the verse that comes to mind is Ki atem yadatem et nefesh hager. You know the soul of the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Rashi comments on that. It's a very strange, I've never known how to place this comment. It says, the mum shebach, the wound that you have, don't put it onto others. Now, maybe that means if you've been a refugee, don't make others outsiders and strangers. That reminds me of the man I saw on a film about South Tel Aviv and Darfuri refugees, now going back 20 years, with this huge vat of soup, doling it out and saying, I'm having none of the racism in my own society. My parents were refugees to this country. I'm helping the people who come here from Darfur. But it could also mean it's hard to be a refugee and help others with a way that hurts. Nachmanides, Spanish Jewish commentator of the 13th century, says about this verse, God is always with the voice of the outsider, the person who has no one else to turn to. And that's where we have to locate ourselves, and that's also part of what the AJR does and what the AJR has to do. If people read the long read in last Thursday's Guardian by Zalasht Halamzai, whom I've got to know a bit, she's a family of refugees from Afghanistan, and she grew up mainly in this country, but she's worked most of her life in the Refugee Trauma Initiative, basing herself in Greece. It's the second piece she's written for The Guardian, and she's writing about the horrors of people contacting her from Afghanistan now, unable to get out. And whatever the Taliban may be saying publicly, what's happening actually is incomparably worse. And she writes here, as dark as it gets, there were moments of hope. When some members of the Afghan girls' robotics team, a celebrated group of young scientists, got out, I felt myself able to relax for a brief moment. When I contacted the leaders of the Jewish community in London, they responded with heartfelt solidarity and sponsorship of Afghan families in the UK. Many recognized their own families' experiences in the images of parents handing their children over. I know many Jewish people who are really saying, well, okay, that was expressions of support, but what can we actually do? And again, that's something which an organization like the AJR has a role with. And to come finally before I finish, to not just particular refugee situations, but a wider sense of populism and the sense of nationalism and racism that accompanies it, which you spoke about earlier today. I read David Nassau's book, The Last Million, about the displaced persons from 1945 to 1948, mainly in Germany, but across Europe. And a most disconcerting chapter was what workforce did the Western countries, America, Canada, Australia, Britain, and others, want to take out of the people in those displaced persons camps. And what I found particularly painful is that white men took precedence along with young white girls over everybody else as being integrated and not standing out in society. That meant that Latvians, Lithuanians, people who had fought alongside the Nazi armies, sometimes in the SS, took precedence over Jews. When I then read Amelia Gentleman's book, The Winthrop Betrayal, I realized that some of the same thought process is at work and was at work in the hostile environment, which is ongoing from the Home Office of this country. So speaking up, speaking out, even if it's unpopular, is a really important part of the responsibility that our history has left us with. A member of my community was trying to help a particular Afghan family. He said, you're told by the Home Office to go online. When you go online, you get a phone number. when you ring the phone number, she said, you're told to go back online, or to put down a certain amount of money in the phone call to be able to chat to a call that nobody answers. So that legacy of a profound, continuous responsibility towards refugees, towards understanding the nature of a society that welcomes, integrates, and also supports the most vulnerable. This is what the future has to hold, as well as bringing us cultural and personal companionship in the different generations of refugee in which we find ourselves. Thank you.